Hey guys, tonight we're climbing back aboard a Viking longship. A long, narrow wooden vessel rocking gently on cold northern waters. The wind is sharp. The air smells faintly of salt, damp wool, and wood that has spent too much of its life surrounded by waves. And somewhere on that narrow deck, between shields, oars, ropes, and barrels of food, a group of Vikings is trying to do something that sounds completely unreasonable. They are trying to sleep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the stranger corners of history. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, if you imagine sleeping on a Viking longship, your first thought might be that it sounds unpleasant. Not just uncomfortable, but actively hostile to the concept of rest. The deck is narrow. The ship moves constantly. The wind never really stops. Waves slap against the hull like they have personal opinions about your life choices. And there are no cabins. No cozy bunks. No hammocks gently swaying in polite agreement with the ocean. Just wooden benches, damp cloaks, and the quiet understanding that gravity exists. Modern ships try very hard to protect people from the sea. Viking ships did almost the opposite. They exposed you directly to it. Which means the question naturally appears. How exactly did Vikings manage to sleep on these ships without rolling off the side and becoming an accidental offering to the North Sea? The answer, like many Viking solutions, was surprisingly practical. And also surprisingly simple. First, it's important to understand how a longship was arranged. Inside the ship, running along both sides, were long wooden benches. During the day, these benches were where the rowers sat. Each man had a position along the ship, an oar to manage. And very little personal space. But when night came, or when the ship paused in calmer waters, those same benches became beds. Not luxurious beds. Not even particularly comfortable beds. But beds nonetheless. A Viking would spread his cloak, or sometimes a small bundle of furs, across the wooden plank and lie down along the length of the bench. If you're picturing a mattress, you can stop picturing that immediately. The Viking version of bedding was usually just what they were already wearing. Heavy wool cloaks. Animal skins. Occasionally a small blanket if someone had been lucky enough to bring one along. This might sound miserable by modern standards, but Vikings were used to sleeping on firm surfaces. In their homes, many people slept on wooden platforms or simple straw bedding. Compared to that, a longship bench was simply a slightly more mobile version of the same idea. Of course, the bigger problem wasn't the hardness of the bed. It was the movement. A longship never sits completely still. Even in relatively calm water, it shifts, rocks, and sways with the slow rhythm of the sea. Which means sleeping on one is less like lying on a bed and more like trying to nap on a very determined rocking chair. But here's where Viking ship design quietly helped. Longships were extremely flexible. The hull wasn't rigid like later ships. Instead, the overlapping planks of wood allowed the vessel to bend slightly with the waves. Rather than fighting the sea, the ship moved with it. This made the motion smoother. Not calm, exactly. But predictable. And humans are surprisingly good at adapting to predictable motion. If you've ever fallen asleep in a moving car, train, or airplane, you've experienced something similar. Once the rhythm becomes familiar, your brain stops treating it as a threat. It becomes background noise. For Vikings who spent weeks or months at sea, that rhythm quickly became normal. The rocking of the ship wasn't disturbing their sleep. It was part of it. The material still helped trap body heat. Add a cloak, a fur skin, and the collective warmth of several nearby humans, and the sleeping arrangement became surprisingly effective. Not cozy. But survivable. Sometimes shields were also used creatively. Viking shields lined the sides of the ship during travel, hung along the railings. At night, some of these shields could be rearranged to block wind or spray. They became a kind of temporary wall, protecting sleeping crew members from the worst of the cold gusts. Again, this wasn't luxury. It was improvisation. But Viking crews were very good at improvisation. Another important factor was timing. Longships often didn't travel continuously through the night unless necessary. If the crew could reach land, even a small stretch of beach, they would pull the ship ashore and sleep on land instead. Longships were light enough for crews to drag them onto sand or shallow banks. This had several advantages. Sleeping on solid ground was easier. Fires could be lit for warmth. Food could be prepared more comfortably. And perhaps most importantly, someone didn't have to worry about rolling into the ocean while dreaming about breakfast. But during longer voyages, when land wasn't immediately available, the ship itself became the sleeping place. In those situations, routines formed quickly. Some men slept while others stayed awake to keep watch. Not necessarily for enemies, but for weather. The sea can change its mood very quickly, and a sudden storm could turn a calm night into chaos. So a few crew members always remained alert, sitting near the steering or scanning the horizon. These watchers ensured the ship stayed on course and that sleeping Vikings did not wake up in dramatically worse circumstances than when they closed their eyes. And slowly, night after night, the crew adjusted. The creaking of wood became normal. The soft slap of waves against the hull faded into background sound. The steady breathing of dozens of exhausted men created its own rhythm. In time, the longship stopped feeling like a precarious wooden plank floating in cold water. It became something else. A temporary home. Not a comfortable one. Not a permanent one. But a place where bodies could rest long enough to face another day of wind, waves, and rowing. And surprisingly, it worked. Not perfectly. Not elegantly. But effectively enough that Viking ships crossed enormous distances. Across the North Sea. Across the Baltic. Even across the Atlantic. All while their crews managed the simple but essential human task of sleep on narrow wooden benches. Which, when you think about it, is a quietly impressive achievement. Because while conquering lands and raiding monasteries gets most of the historical attention, the ability to sleep without falling into freezing water probably mattered just as much. And the Vikings, as usual, solved the problem with a combination of practicality, stubbornness, and a willingness to accept that comfort was not part of the job description. And once a Viking finally managed to fall asleep on that narrow wooden bench, another quiet challenge appeared. Staying asleep. Because life on a longship was never completely still, never completely silent, and never completely predictable. Even on calm nights, the ship had its own language of noises. Wood creaked as the hull flexed gently with the waves. Ropes shifted softly against wooden posts. The sail, if it was still raised, fluttered and sighed in the night wind. And beneath all of it was the constant sound of water. The sea brushing along the sides of the ship. A slow, rhythmic hush. 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 For modern listeners, that sound might actually feel relaxing. Ocean waves are famous for helping people fall asleep. But on a Viking longship, the sound carried a slightly different meaning. It was a reminder that the sea was always there, always moving, always capable of changing its mind. And that meant sleep had to be flexible. Vikings rarely expected long, uninterrupted nights of rest at sea. Instead, they slept when they could. Short stretches. A few hours here. Another hour there. Sometimes the crew rotated watch duties through the night. A small number of men stayed awake while the others slept, then they switched later. It wasn't a perfectly organized system written down in neat instructions. But it worked because everyone understood the stakes. If something went wrong on the water, someone needed to notice quickly. Storm clouds forming. A change in wind direction. Another ship appearing unexpectedly on the horizon. Sleep was important. But survival was more important. So the men on watch stayed alert, often wrapped in thick cloaks against the cold, quietly observing the dark sea while the rest of the crew rested. And the darkness at sea was a very particular kind of darkness. Out on open water, far from towns or fires, the night sky becomes enormous. Stars stretch across the sky in numbers that feel almost impossible. To a Viking sailor, those stars weren't just decoration. They were tools. Navigation in the Viking world relied heavily on landmarks, coastlines, and knowledge passed down through generations. But at night, when land disappeared into darkness, the stars helped confirm direction. A sailor lying awake on watch might quietly track the movement of familiar constellations. Not necessarily with scientific precision, but with the kind of practical awareness that comes from experience. If the stars drifted in the wrong way across the sky, it might mean the ship had turned slightly off course. Small corrections could then be made before morning. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew slept as best they could. And exhaustion made that easier. Rowing a longship was not gentle work. Each oar could be several meters long, heavy enough to demand serious effort with every pull. When the wind died and the sail went slack, the crew became the engine. Dozens of men rowing together, hour after hour, pushing the ship forward through cold northern waters. By the end of a long rowing day, muscles burned. Hands blistered. Shoulders ached. Under those conditions, sleep came quickly. Even if the bed was a wooden plank. Even if the wind was cold. Even if the sea occasionally reminded everyone who was really in charge. There were, of course, nights when sleeping became significantly more complicated. Storms. The North Sea is famous for them. A calm evening could turn into chaos surprisingly quickly. Wind rising. Waves growing taller. Rain arriving sideways. When storms struck, sleeping was no longer part of the plan. The crew had work to do. Sails might need to be lowered quickly to prevent the mast from snapping under too much pressure. Loose equipment had to be secured. Water that splashed into the ship had to be bailed out. And everyone needed to stay balanced. A Viking longship was seaworthy, but it relied heavily on the skill and coordination of its crew. During heavy weather, men moved carefully across the deck, gripping ropes and wooden edges while the ship rose and fell with the waves. In those moments, the idea of sleep disappeared completely. The goal became endurance. Ride out the storm. Keep the ship steady. Trust the design that Viking shipbuilders had perfected over generations. And those ships really were remarkable pieces of engineering. Longships were built using a technique called clinker construction. Instead of smooth planks laid edge to edge, the wooden boards overlapped like layers of scales. This gave the hull flexibility and strength. Rather than breaking under the pressure of waves, the ship could bend slightly, absorbing the force of the sea. To someone standing on deck during a storm, that flexibility probably felt unsettling. The ship might twist and creak in ways that sounded alarming. But those sounds were actually signs that the design was working exactly as intended. The ship was moving with the ocean instead of fighting it. Eventually, storms passed. They always do. The wind softened. The waves calmed. And the crew slowly returned to their routines. Wet cloaks were wrung out. Equipment was checked. Food was eaten if anyone still had the energy. And then, one by one, men lay back down along the benches. Exhaustion usually made the decision easy. Sleep returned quickly. Sometimes the sky above the ship cleared after a storm, revealing a quiet, brilliant field of stars. Other times a soft gray dawn arrived instead. Morning at sea often came slowly. First the horizon brightened. Then the dark water turned steel gray. Then the sun appeared, low and pale above the waves. For the crew of a longship, morning meant movement again. Cloaks shaken out. Oars lifted. Sail adjusted to catch the wind. And somewhere among the crew, someone probably stretched stiff muscles and thought briefly about how nice solid ground would feel. But the ship kept moving. Day after day. Night after night. Across distances that still impress historians today. From Scandinavia to the British Isles. From Norway to Iceland. From Iceland to Greenland. And eventually, even to the distant shores of North America. All of it accomplished on ships that offered very little comfort. But just enough practicality. Just enough design brilliance. And just enough stubborn human determination. Because while history often celebrates Viking battles, raids, and exploration, the quieter reality was that most of their time at sea was spent doing very ordinary human things. Eating. Working. Staying warm. And trying to get a little sleep on a narrow wooden bench while the entire ocean gently rocked the world back and forth beneath them. And somehow, night after night, they managed it. And as the voyage stretched on, something else quietly happened to the crew. They adapted. Not just physically, but mentally. At the beginning of a journey, the longship might feel unstable. Every shift of the hull might wake someone. Every sudden splash might make a sleeper open one eye and check that they were still safely aboard. But after several days, the ship's movements started to feel familiar. The human body is remarkably good at adjusting to patterns. Sailors throughout history have described the same strange experience. The first nights at sea can feel restless and awkward. But eventually, the rhythm of the water becomes almost comforting. Your body begins to expect it. The slow rise and fall of the ship becomes a kind of lullaby. And for Vikings, that rhythm was something they often grew up with. Many of them had spent time on small boats since childhood. Fishing vessels, coastal trading boats, short crossings between islands. So by the time a man found himself sleeping on a longship during a major voyage, the motion of water beneath wood was not entirely new. It was simply a larger version of something familiar. Another thing that helped was routine. Human beings sleep better when their bodies fall into predictable cycles. Even on a longship, those cycles slowly formed. Morning meant rowing or sailing. Midday meant food, repairs, or navigation. Evening meant preparing the ship for night. And eventually, resting. The crew might not always sleep at the exact same hour every night, but their bodies learned when it was time to relax and when it was time to stay alert. Of course, sleeping outdoors had its own complications. Weather was always involved. Some nights were surprisingly peaceful. A light wind. Gentle waves. A sky full of stars stretching endlessly above the ship. On nights like that, a Viking lying on a wooden bench might feel something close to calm. The world reduced to a simple scene. Dark water. Quiet wind. The occasional creak of wood. And the soft breathing of the crew around him. But other nights were less cooperative. Rain could arrive without much warning. Cold droplets tapping against shields and soaking into cloaks. In those moments, sleeping required a certain level of determination. Cloaks were pulled tighter. Bodies curled slightly inward to conserve warmth. And the crew simply endured it. One advantage Vikings had was the quality of their clothing. Wool garments were thick and durable. When layered properly, they created pockets of warm air close to the body. Fur cloaks, when available, added even more insulation. Even damp clothing could still provide warmth, which was extremely valuable in northern waters. This didn't make rainy nights comfortable. But it made them survivable. And survival was usually the goal. Another quiet factor that influenced sleep was trust. On a longship, every crew member depended on the others. The man steering the ship needed to trust the rowers. The rowers needed to trust the lookout. The lookout needed to trust that someone would wake the crew if danger appeared. Without that trust, sleep would have been impossible. If every Viking believed he had to stay awake personally to watch the sea, no one would ever rest. But longship crews were usually made up of people who knew each other. Men from the same village. Relatives. Friends. Warriors who had traveled together before. That familiarity created confidence. When your turn to sleep arrived, you could close your eyes knowing someone else was watching the horizon. And eventually, the night would pass. Morning light creeping slowly across the water. Cold air turning slightly warmer. The smell of salt and damp would lingering around the ship. Crew members waking gradually, stretching stiff arms and legs after another night on narrow benches. There was rarely a dramatic wake-up call. No bells. No shouting. Just movement. Someone sitting up. Someone adjusting a cloak. Someone quietly checking the ropes or the sail. Then the ship returned to life. Oars lifted from their resting places. Water dripping from the blades as they dipped into the sea. Rowing began again, the steady rhythm echoing along the length of the ship. Pull. Slide. Pull. Slide. It was hard work, but it was familiar work. And familiarity makes difficult things easier to endure. Food also played a role in helping the crew sleep. Viking ship provisions were simple but effective. Dried fish. Salted meat. Hard bread. Sometimes porridge if they could cook. These foods were designed to last long voyages without spoiling quickly. They were not luxurious, but they provided energy. After a long day of rowing or sailing, a solid meal, even a simple one, made a noticeable difference. A full stomach helps the body relax. Muscles recover. Energy returns. And sleep comes more naturally. Though Viking sailors had to be careful not to eat too much before sleeping, especially when the ship was rocking. An overly enthusiastic dinner followed by rough waves could produce an entirely different kind of midnight event. One that everyone nearby would remember. So moderation was often wise. As the voyage continued day after day, sleep became less of a struggle and more of a routine. The benches felt familiar. The sounds of the ship became background noise. Even the cold air began to feel normal. The crew simply accepted the conditions. And acceptance is a powerful tool. When people stop fighting discomfort, they often adapt to it surprisingly well. This mindset was common in Viking culture. Their world was not designed for comfort. Farming in northern climates was difficult. Winters were long and harsh. Travel was dangerous. Hardship was expected. So sleeping on a moving ship in cold weather was not considered especially unusual. It was simply part of the job. Part of the journey. And the journey itself mattered. Longships were not just transportation. They were the vehicles that allowed Vikings to explore, trade, raid, and settle new lands. Without them, Viking history would look completely different. So every night spent sleeping on those narrow benches was another small step across the map. Another mile of ocean behind them. Another unknown shore slowly drawing closer. And in that quiet way, between rowing shifts and storm watches, the simple act of sleeping helped power one of the most remarkable periods of exploration in medieval history. Not through grand heroic moments, but through small human ones. Closing tired eyes. Listening to the wind. Feeling the ship rise and fall beneath the stars. And trusting that when morning arrived, the longship would still be moving forward across the cold northern sea. And as the longship continued its steady journey across the water, the crew slowly settled into a rhythm that repeated itself day after day. Wake. Row. Eat. Repair. Watch the horizon. Sleep. It might not sound exciting, but most life at sea rarely is. Long voyages are not filled with constant action. Instead, they are made up of long stretches of quiet work and patience. For a Viking crew, patience was an important skill. The sea does not hurry. Wind does not follow schedules. Some days the sail filled beautifully, catching a strong steady breeze that pushed the ship forward with surprising speed. On those days the rowers could rest more often, stretching sore arms and letting the wind do the hard work. Other days were slower. The air might become still and heavy. The sail would hang limp from the mast like a tired banner, barely moving. When that happened, the oars returned to the water. Rowing began again. Pull. Slide. Pull. Slide. Dozens of men moving together in a careful rhythm so that the long oars did not collide with each other. Coordination mattered. If one man rowed too early or too late, the movement could disrupt the entire line. But Viking crews practiced this constantly. The rhythm eventually became automatic. And after hours of rowing, the moment when someone could lie down again on the bench felt well earned. Another small detail that helped Vikings sleep on longships was balance. A longship might look narrow, but it was carefully designed to distribute weight evenly. The crew did not all lie down on one side of the vessel. If they had, the ship would lean dangerously. Instead, the men were spread along both sides of the ship. Some sleeping. Some sitting. Some standing watch. The weight balanced the vessel naturally. This also meant that no one person was carrying too much responsibility for stability. The ship remained steady because everyone played a small role. Even while sleeping. Sometimes the crew used their shields in clever ways at night. During travel, shields often hung along the outer rail of the ship, forming a kind of protective barrier. At night, a few shields could be shifted slightly to block strong wind or reduce sea spray that occasionally splashed onto the deck. It wasn't a perfect wall, but it helped. A shield angled in the right place could stop a cold gust from hitting someone directly while they slept. These small adjustments made a noticeable difference after several hours of exposure. Of course, there were always small annoyances that came with sleeping on a ship. For example, ropes. Longships carried a surprising number of ropes used to control the sail, secure equipment, and tie down supplies. During the day they were carefully managed. But at night, when the ship was dimly lit by moonlight or starlight, a loose rope could become an unexpected obstacle. A Viking sitting up suddenly might find his foot tangled. Or someone trying to stretch might accidentally bump into a coil of rope left beside a bench. These were minor problems, but they were common enough that experienced sailors learned quickly where everything was stored. Familiarity helped avoid unnecessary midnight surprises. Then there was the smell. Life on a longship was cleaner than many later ships because waste and food scraps were quickly thrown overboard. But that didn't mean the ship smelled like fresh pine forests. There were still dozens of men wearing wool clothing that had seen days of hard work. Salt spray dried on fabric. Sweat collected in layers of clothing. Leather belts and boots held the scent of long travel. The result was a smell that was memorable. Not overwhelming, but definitely noticeable. Fortunately, the open design of the ship helped. Wind moved constantly across the deck, carrying away most odors before they could become unbearable. And after a few days, the crew probably stopped noticing the smell altogether. Humans adapt quickly to familiar environments. What seems strong at first eventually fades into the background. Another unexpected challenge during long voyages was boredom. Modern stories about Vikings focus heavily on raids and battles, but those dramatic moments were rare compared to the long hours spent simply traveling. When the sea was calm and the wind steady, there might be very little to do. Rowing took concentration. Watching the horizon required patience. But during quieter moments, sailors often found small ways to pass the time. Some talked quietly with the men beside them. Stories were shared. Jokes were exchanged. Old adventures were retold, often becoming slightly more impressive with each telling. Others might quietly repair small pieces of equipment. A strap that needed tightening. A rope that needed readying. A cloak that needed stitching. These simple tasks kept hands busy and helped maintain the ship's equipment. And when the sun began to sink again toward the horizon, the familiar evening routine returned. The crew checked the sail. Loose items were secured. Food was shared. And eventually, men began to settle back onto the benches for another night. By this point in the voyage, the process felt natural. Cloaks spread out. Furs arranged. Bodies stretched along the wooden planks. The sky slowly darkened above them. Stars appeared one by one. The sea continued its endless movement beneath the hull. Somewhere near the stern, a watchman remained awake, quietly observing the water and sky. Everyone else closed their eyes. And once again, the longship drifted through the night with a crew of sleeping Vikings resting only a few feet above the cold northern sea. It might seem like a fragile arrangement. A narrow wooden ship. No walls. No beds. No safety rails. Just tired sailors trusting the balance of the vessel and the rhythm of the water. But night after night, it worked. Because Viking longships were not just built for speed or warfare. They were built for survival. And in the quiet hours between sunset and sunrise, when the crew lay sleeping beneath the stars, that careful design proved itself again and again. The ship held steady. The sea carried them forward. And by morning, the journey continued. And as the days slowly blended together out on the open water, the crew began to notice something curious about life on a longship. Time started to feel different. On land, time is marked by many small things. Church bells ringing in distant villages. Farmers beginning their work in nearby fields. Market stalls opening. Fires being lit in homes as evening approaches. But at sea, most of those familiar signals disappear. Out on the open water, there are only a few simple markers left. Sunrise. Sunset. Weather. And the steady progress of the ship itself. For a Viking sailor lying on his bench at night, staring up at the sky, the stars often became the closest thing to a clock. Constellations slowly moved across the darkness. Patterns that experienced sailors knew well. The Big Dipper, for example, helped point toward the North Star. That single bright star remained relatively fixed in the sky, quietly marking the direction of north. Even if Vikings didn't describe it using modern astronomy, they understood its usefulness. A man on watch might glance upward now and then, confirming that the ship was still moving in roughly the right direction. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew slept beneath that same sky. And sleep at sea had another interesting effect on the body. The constant movement of the ship often encouraged deeper rest. The slow rocking motion could lull the body into relaxation, similar to how infants are gently rocked to sleep. Of course, the sea's version of rocking was sometimes less gentle. But on calmer nights, that steady motion made it surprisingly easy for exhausted sailors to drift off. Even the sounds contributed to it. The creak of wood. The rustle of sailcloth. The quiet splash of water sliding along the hull. These noises repeated over and over again, forming a kind of natural rhythm. After a few days, the brain began to treat these sounds as normal background noise rather than potential danger. It's similar to how people living near train tracks eventually stop noticing the trains passing by. The mind adjusts. And once that adjustment happened, Vikings could fall asleep surprisingly quickly. There were, however, certain nights when sleep was interrupted for reasons that had nothing to do with weather or waves. Occasionally, the crew would spot something unusual in the distance. A faint shape on the horizon. Perhaps another ship. Perhaps land. Or perhaps something less easy to explain. The sea has always been a place where imagination becomes very active. Strange lights on the water. Unfamiliar sounds in the fog. Large shapes moving beneath the surface. For sailors living 1,000 years ago, these things sometimes carried deeper meanings. Stories about sea creatures were common in Viking culture. Massive serpents said to live in the deepest waters. Enormous whales mistaken for islands. Creatures that appeared briefly before vanishing again beneath the waves. Whether these sightings were exaggerated encounters with real animals or simply the tricks of light and shadow, they added an extra layer of mystery to long voyages. A sailor on watch during a quiet night might stare out into the darkness and wonder what might be swimming beneath the ship. Not necessarily with fear, but with curiosity. The ocean was vast, and much of it remained unknown. Still, despite these occasional mysteries, most nights were calm. The longship cut steadily through the water. Crew members slept along the benches. A faint glow from the moon might reflect across the surface of the sea. And somewhere near the bow of the ship, waves parted quietly as the vessel moved forward. Morning would eventually arrive again. The sky slowly brightening. Cold air brushing across tired faces. And one by one, the crew would wake. Some stretched their arms carefully after hours on hard wooden benches. Others simply sat up and pulled their cloaks tighter around their shoulders. There was rarely much complaining. Complaints didn't improve the weather. They didn't shorten the voyage. And they certainly didn't make the benches any softer. Instead, the crew simply began another day. Food was shared. Water was rationed carefully. The sail was checked. And if the wind allowed, the longship surged forward once more. But occasionally, the most welcome sight of all appeared on the horizon. Land. A faint dark line between sea and sky. At first it might be easy to mistake for a cloud or distant fog. But as the ship drew closer, the shape became clearer. Cliffs. Hills. A coastline slowly rising from the water. For sailors who had spent days or weeks surrounded only by ocean, the sight of land was deeply satisfying. Not just because it meant progress in the journey, but because it meant something else. Solid ground. A chance to step off the narrow wooden deck. A chance to stretch legs that had grown stiff from rowing and balancing on a moving ship. And perhaps most importantly, a chance to sleep somewhere that wasn't gently rocking beneath them. When possible, Viking crews pulled their longships onto shore. The ships were designed to make this surprisingly easy. Their shallow draft allowed them to glide into shallow water, and with enough hands pushing together, the vessel could be dragged safely onto sand or smooth stones. Once ashore, the crew could build small fires. Food could be cooked more comfortably. Wet clothing could dry properly in the open air. And sleeping arrangements improved immediately. Instead of narrow benches, men could stretch out fully on the ground. Cloaks and furs laid across grass or sand. The earth felt wonderfully stable beneath them. No rocking. No sudden waves slapping the hull. Just stillness. After nights spent balancing on a moving ship, that stillness probably felt luxurious. Even if the ground was cold. Even if the wind still blew across the shoreline. Because sometimes the greatest comfort isn't softness or warmth. Sometimes it's simply the absence of motion. But eventually, the journey always continued. Supplies were gathered. The ship was pushed back toward the water. Oars were lifted into place. And once again, the longship slid across the surface of the sea. Carrying its crew toward new shores, new challenges, and many more nights spent sleeping beneath the open sky. Balance between wood and water. Between exhaustion and exploration. And between the quiet human need for rest. And the endless movement of the Northern Ocean. And once the longship left the safety of shore again, the quiet rhythm of sea travel returned almost immediately. The shoreline slowly faded behind them. The sounds of land, birds, wind through trees, distant animals, disappeared one by one. Soon there was only the sea again. Endless water stretching to every horizon. For the crew, this moment often brought a strange mix of feelings. Part of them appreciated the stability of solid ground they had just left behind. Sleeping on land, even briefly, reminded the body how pleasant stillness could be. But another part of them was already adjusting back to the ship. Because a longship in motion had its own kind of comfort. It was familiar. Predictable. And most importantly, it meant the journey was continuing. By now the crew had become deeply accustomed to their floating routine. Everyone knew their position. Everyone knew where to sit, where to sleep, where their gear was stored. Even small details became second nature. For example, experienced sailors learned exactly how to lie down on the benches to make sleeping easier. Instead of stretching completely flat, many Vikings slept slightly curled. One arm folded beneath the head or tucked under a cloak. A knee bent slightly to keep balance as the ship moved. This position helped the body absorb the motion of the vessel more naturally. It also kept limbs from drifting too far across the bench and accidentally bumping into neighbors. And neighbors were always close. Privacy on a Viking longship did not really exist. The crew lived together in a narrow shared space for days or weeks at a time. They ate together. Worked together. Slept only a few inches apart. Under those conditions, small habits formed quickly. People learned who snored the loudest. Who tended to toss and turn. Who woke up early and who preferred to sleep a little longer when possible. These small details might sound trivial, but they mattered. Harmony among the crew made long voyages far easier. And longship crews depended heavily on cooperation. Every man had a role. Some were stronger rowers. Some were better navigators. Some had sharp eyes for spotting distant land or approaching ships. Others were skilled at repairing sails or ropes when something broke. At night, those same people became sleeping companions. Dozens of warriors and sailors resting side by side under the open sky. And the sky itself was always changing. On clear nights, the stars shone so brightly that the surface of the water sometimes reflected them faintly. It could feel almost as if the ship were floating between two skies. One above. One below. Other nights were darker. Clouds rolling in from the horizon. Wind whispering across the sail. Occasionally fog crept across the water as well. Fog at sea creates a very strange environment. Sound travels differently in thick mist. Distant noises seem closer. Nearby shapes appear and disappear without warning. A longship moving through fog had to proceed carefully. The crew listened as much as they looked. The creak of another ship. The cry of seabirds circling nearby. Even the change in how waves moved could hint that land was approaching. During foggy nights, the watchmen remained especially alert. The rest of the crew still slept when they could, but awareness remained high. Because the sea, calm as it sometimes seemed, never completely lost its unpredictability. Yet despite all these challenges, cold air, moving water, narrow benches, Viking crews still managed to rest well enough to keep traveling. Which says something interesting about human resilience. Comfort is a luxury. But sleep is a necessity. And when necessary, people find ways to make it work. The Vikings did not wait for perfect conditions before resting. They slept when their bodies demanded it. Wherever space allowed. However the ship happened to be moving at that moment. Over time, this ability to adapt gave them a quiet advantage. Their ships could travel farther. Their crews could endure longer journeys. And their explorations could reach places that many others might have considered too distant or too difficult. All supported by something surprisingly simple. A wooden bench. A wool cloak. And a sailor who was tired enough to close his eyes while the ocean rocked gently beneath him. Night after night. Voyage after voyage. The longship carried them forward through darkness and daylight alike. And each evening, when the sun finally dipped below the horizon again, the familiar routine returned. Cloaks wrapped tightly. Bodies stretched along the benches. A few watchmen remaining awake. The rest drifting slowly into sleep. Above them, the vast northern sky. Below them, the endless movement of the sea. And somewhere in between, a narrow wooden ship carrying tired sailors quietly across the waters of the Viking world. And as the voyage continued farther from familiar shores, the Longship slowly became more than just a vessel. It became an entire small world. Everything the crew needed was contained within that narrow wooden frame floating across the sea. Food, tools, weapons, clothing, and most importantly, each other. Days passed where nothing much happened. The horizon looked the same in every direction. The water rolled gently beneath the hull. And the crew repeated the same simple routines that kept the ship moving forward. It was during these long stretches that the ability to sleep well became especially valuable. Because exhaustion at sea could be dangerous. A tired rower might lose rhythm. A tired lookout might miss something important in the distance. A tired sailor tying a rope might make a small mistake that later became a bigger problem. So even though sleeping on a wooden bench in cold air might sound unpleasant, it was still essential. The crew needed their strength. They needed clear minds. And they needed patience. At night, when most of the crew settled down to rest, the ship often grew surprisingly quiet. Not completely silent, of course. Would continue to creak gently as the hull flexed with the movement of the waves. Water whispered along the sides of the ship. Sometimes a loose piece of rope tapped softly against a wooden beam. But compared to the busy activity of daytime rowing, the night felt calm. Peaceful, even. The watchman might stand near the stern beside the large steering oar, wrapped tightly in his cloak. From that position he could see most of the ship. The rows of shields along the rail. The sail hanging quietly in the darkness. The shapes of sleeping crew members stretched along the benches. Every now and then someone might shift in their sleep. A cloak rustling. A quiet sigh. But most of the time the ship simply glided forward through the night. The watchman's eyes would move slowly across the horizon again and again. Scanning for anything unusual. A distant sail. A sudden shift in the wind. Dark clouds forming where the sky met the water. Because weather was always the sea's greatest surprise. Clear nights could turn rough faster than anyone liked. And when that happened, sleeping ended quickly. The crew would wake, sometimes before they fully understood why. Wind growing louder. The sails snapping sharply. Waves slapping harder against the hull. Men rising from the benches, grabbing ropes, steadying themselves as the ship rocked more aggressively. But those moments, dramatic as they were still only brief interruptions in much longer journeys. Most nights passed quietly. And over time the crew developed an instinct for the ship's movement. A Viking sleeping on the bench could often feel changes in the sea even before fully waking. A slightly different tilt. A sharper bounce of the hull. Sometimes that subtle awareness was enough to open an eye and check the sky before drifting back to sleep. The body learns quickly when its safety depends on paying attention. Yet despite these constant adjustments, longship travel also brought moments of beauty. Moments that made the hardships feel worthwhile. Occasionally, when the sea was especially calm, the surface of the water reflected the moon so clearly that it created a shimmering silver path stretching across the waves. The ship would glide quietly through that pale light. The sail glowing faintly overhead. And the water around the hull glowing softly as it moved. Sometimes sea creatures followed the ship as well. Schools of fish flashing briefly beneath the surface. Seabirds gliding overhead. Resting on the water for a moment before lifting back into the wind. To a sailor lying awake on the bench, those quiet sights might fill long stretches of the night. No conversation needed. Just observation. The sea itself providing endless small details to notice. And slowly, day by day, the voyage progressed. Landfalls came and went. Supplies were used carefully. Equipment was repaired when needed. Sleep continued in the same simple way. Bench. Cloak. Sky. Ocean. In many ways it was a very basic existence. No luxuries. No soft beds. No private rooms. Just practical solutions to practical problems. But those solutions were good enough. Good enough to cross vast distances. Good enough to support voyages that eventually carried Vikings to Iceland, Greenland, and even the distant coastlines of North America. All accomplished by crews who spent their nights resting only a few feet above cold, restless water. Balanced between the solid wood of the ship and the endless motion of the sea. And each night, as darkness returned and the stars spread once again across the northern sky, the same quiet scene repeated itself. Tired sailors settling down along the benches. A few watchmen standing guard. The sail shifting gently in the wind. And a narrow Viking longship continuing its steady journey across the open ocean. And after enough days at sea, something else quietly happened to the crew. The longship stopped feeling temporary. At the beginning of a voyage, every sailor is very aware that he is standing on a narrow piece of wood floating in cold water. Every movement feels noticeable. Every wave feels slightly suspicious. But after a week or two, the ship begins to feel almost stable. Not because the ocean has become calmer, but because the crew has adjusted to it. Balance becomes automatic. A man can walk across the deck without looking at his feet. He knows exactly where the benches are, where the ropes lie, and where the edge of the ship begins. Even in the dark. His body remembers the layout. This familiarity also makes sleeping easier. Instead of constantly worrying about rolling the wrong direction, a sailor begins to trust his instincts. He knows how the ship usually moves, and his body reacts naturally. It's similar to people who live in houses near rivers or forests. At first, every unfamiliar sound seems important. But after a while, the creaks and rustles become part of normal life. The longship became that kind of environment. A place where small noises were expected. The creaking of the mast as the wind shifted. The gentle knock of a loose wooden peg. The low hum of the sail as it caught the breeze. All of these sounds blended together into the quiet nighttime soundtrack of a Viking voyage. Sometimes, if the sea was calm enough, the ship moved almost silently. Just the faint whisper of water along the hull. And above it, the vast sky. For sailors who spent many nights outdoors, the sky became something they knew almost as well as the ship itself. Certain stars appeared at familiar times. Certain constellations drifted slowly across the darkness as the hours passed. A watchman might notice when the position of the stars told him that midnight had probably come and gone. Not exactly with modern precision, of course. But close enough. And when a long night watch finally ended, another sailor would quietly take his place. The change happened gently so the rest of the crew could keep sleeping. Because uninterrupted sleep was valuable. Rowing required strength. Handling sails required coordination. Even simple tasks like hauling equipment or steering demanded steady hands. A tired crew could make mistakes. And the sea was not very forgiving of mistakes. Still, not every interruption came from weather or watch duties. Sometimes the sea itself had surprises. A sudden wave might slap against the side of the ship harder than expected, sending a splash of cold water across the deck. A sleeping sailor might wake with a startled breath as icy droplets landed on his face. Nearby crew members might shift or grumble quietly, pulling their cloaks tighter. Then, after a moment, everyone would settle again. Because that was simply life at sea. Small inconveniences happened often enough that they stopped feeling dramatic. Another thing that occasionally interrupted sleep was wildlife. Seabirds sometimes followed ships for long distances, hoping to catch scraps of food tossed overboard. At night, their distant calls could echo across the water. A sharp cry from somewhere above the dark waves. For sailors half asleep, those sounds could seem strangely loud in the otherwise quiet night. Whales were sometimes spotted too. Massive shapes surfacing briefly before disappearing beneath the water again. The slow exhale of breath rising like mist above the sea. Encounters like that reminded sailors just how vast the ocean truly was. The longship might feel like a small world of its own. But it was still only a tiny object crossing a very large and very ancient sea. Yet despite all of this, the cold air, the unpredictable waves, the occasional splash of seawater, Viking sailors kept moving forward. Night after night. Sleeping where they could. Resting when their bodies allowed it. Because the purpose of the voyage always waited somewhere ahead. Trade. Exploration. Raiding. Settlement. Whatever the goal happened to be, it required endurance. And endurance often depends on simple things. Food that lasts long enough. Clothing warm enough to face the wind. And sleep, even if that sleep happens on a narrow wooden bench beneath the open sky. So the longship sailed on. Carrying its crew across dark waters under drifting clouds and distant stars. And each evening, as the sun slipped once again below the horizon, the same quiet scene unfolded. Cloaks spread across wooden benches. Shields rattling softly along the rail. A few sailors remaining awake to watch the horizon. And the rest of the crew slowly drifting into sleep while the ship rocked gently beneath them. A fragile balance of wood, water, and human determination. But one that worked well enough to carry Viking sailors across some of the most challenging seas in the medieval world. And after many nights spent sleeping beneath the open sky, the crew of the longship began to develop a strange kind of relationship with the sea itself. At first, the ocean feels like an obstacle. Cold, unpredictable, and far too large to feel comfortable. But the longer sailors remain on it, the more familiar it becomes. The sounds, the smells, the movement of the waves, all of it slowly turns into something expected. Something almost ordinary. A Viking lying awake on his bench late at night might notice small patterns in the water. How the waves rolled differently depending on the wind. How the color of the sea changed under moonlight. How the ship's bow sliced quietly through the surface, leaving small lines of foam drifting away into the darkness. These were small observations, but over time they built a kind of understanding. Experienced sailors could read the sea the way farmers read the land. A slight change in the wind. A different pattern in the waves. Even the behavior of birds flying overhead could hint at weather or land nearby. And all of these things were noticed during long quiet hours, especially at night. Because nights at sea often feel longer than nights on land. There are fewer distractions. Fewer sounds. Just the steady movement of the ship and the vast sky stretching endlessly above. Sometimes the moon lit the entire ocean in pale silver. Other nights were darker, with clouds hiding the stars and the horizon disappearing into blackness. During those darker nights, the longship moved forward almost blindly. The crew trusted their direction. Trusted their experience. And trusted the ship itself. Viking shipbuilders had spent generations refining the design of longships. Every plank carefully shaped. Every joint secured with iron rivets. The hull built strong enough to handle powerful waves, yet flexible enough to move with the water. It was a design that looked simple, but behind that simplicity was centuries of knowledge. Knowledge passed from builder to builder, father to son. And that knowledge allowed sailors to sleep at night knowing the vessel beneath them could handle more than it seemed. Still, even with strong ships and experienced crews, the sea demanded respect. A sudden storm could still arrive without warning. Thick fog could hide dangerous coastlines. Strong currents could quietly push a ship away from its intended path. Because of that, Vikings rarely allowed themselves to become careless. Even while resting, someone was always listening. The watchman might pause occasionally, glancing down the length of the ship. The shapes of sleeping sailors rising and falling gently with the motion of the vessel. Shields hanging quietly along the rail. The mast standing tall against the star-filled sky. It was a simple scene, repeated countless times across countless voyages. And yet each of those nights played a small role in something larger. Because every mile traveled brought the longship closer to new places. New rivers. New coastlines. New settlements waiting to be discovered or visited again. Sometimes the destination was a familiar trading port where merchants exchanged goods like furs, silver, and timber. Sometimes it was a distant island where a small Viking settlement already existed. And sometimes the destination was completely unknown. A blank stretch of coast that no one on the ship had ever seen before. Those journeys into the unknown were perhaps the most remarkable of all. Because they required a special kind of patience. Weeks of travel. Endless water. And many nights spent sleeping on wooden benches while trusting that land would eventually appear beyond the horizon. When historians talk about Viking exploration, they often focus on the dramatic moments. The discovery of Iceland. The settlement of Greenland. The brief voyages to North America. But those achievements were built on much quieter moments. Thousands of ordinary nights at sea. Thousands of sailors lying down on narrow benches beneath cold northern skies. Closing their eyes while the ship rocked gently beneath them. Trusting the strength of the vessel. Trusting the skill of the crew. And trusting that the ocean would carry them safely toward whatever waited ahead. So the longship kept moving. Through calm waters and rough storms. Through bright mornings and dark nights. And every evening, as the sky slowly filled with stars again, the same quiet ritual returned. Cloaks pulled tight against the wind. Bodies settling along the wooden benches. A few watchmen standing awake beside the steering oar. And the rest of the crew drifting slowly into sleep as the Viking longship continued its patient journey across the endless northern sea. And as the voyage stretched even longer, the crew began to measure their progress in quieter ways. Not by counting days exactly, because at sea days can blur together. But by noticing small changes around them. The temperature of the wind might shift slightly. Birds might appear more often overhead. Floating pieces of seaweed might drift past the hull. All of these were subtle hints that land might not be as far away as it once was. Experienced sailors paid attention to such details. Because long before anyone could see a coastline, the ocean itself often gave small clues. But until that moment arrived, life on the longship continued in the same steady rhythm. Daytime belonged to work. Night belonged to rest. And the narrow benches remained the crew's nightly refuge. By now, the men had become extremely efficient at preparing their sleeping spots. A cloak folded just right could soften the wooden plank slightly. A small bundle of clothing might be used as a pillow. A fur skin, if someone was lucky enough to have one, added an extra layer of warmth against the cold night air. These small comforts mattered more than they might seem. Because after days of rowing and balancing on a moving deck, even a little bit of warmth and softness made a noticeable difference. Sometimes the crew slept more deeply than expected. The steady rocking of the ship and the exhaustion of travel combined to create a powerful sleep. A sailor might close his eyes for what felt like only a moment, only to wake up hours later with the pale light of dawn already spreading across the horizon. Other nights were lighter. Someone might wake briefly when the wind shifted. Another might sit up for a moment, adjusting his cloak before settling down again. But even with these small interruptions, the crew managed enough rest to keep going. And keep going they did. The longship sliced steadily through the water day after day. Its narrow shape designed perfectly for speed. The dragon-headed prow rising above the waves, watching the horizon as if the ship itself were searching for new lands. Those carved heads at the front of Viking ships were more than decoration. They were meant to be intimidating. A warning to enemies and perhaps a symbolic protector for the crew. But during quiet nights, with the stars overhead and the sea calm around them, that fierce wooden dragon simply became another silent companion on the voyage. Standing guard while the sailors slept behind it. Sometimes the night sky itself offered moments that sailors would remember for years. In the far north, strange lights occasionally appeared above the horizon. Soft waves of green and pale white drifting slowly across the sky. The Northern Lights. To modern observers, we know these lights are caused by particles from the sun interacting with Earth's atmosphere. But to Viking sailors watching from a longship centuries ago, the sight must have felt mysterious and powerful. The glowing ribbons of light moved silently across the heavens. Sometimes bright, sometimes faint, but always beautiful. A sailor lying on the bench might watch them quietly for a few moments before sleep returned. The sea reflecting faint hints of color as the ship drifted beneath the glowing sky. Moments like that reminded sailors how vast their world truly was. And how small their ship seemed beneath it. Yet that small ship kept moving, carrying its crew across distances that still surprise historians today. Because Viking longships were not large by modern standards. They had no engines, no complex navigation instruments, no comfortable sleeping cabins. Just wood, sailcloth, rope, and human effort. And yet those simple tools were enough. Enough to cross the North Sea. Enough to reach distant islands. Enough to carry explorers farther west than most Europeans would travel for centuries. All supported by the quiet routines of daily life aboard the ship. Eating simple meals. Repairing worn equipment. Watching the sky for weather. And every night, lying down once again on the narrow benches. Trusting that sleep would come despite the cold wind and the constant movement of the sea. Eventually, every voyage reached its end. Land appeared. The ship slowed. Oars dipped carefully into the water as the crew guided the vessel toward shore. But before that final moment arrived, there were always many more nights like this one. The longship gliding quietly through the darkness. The sea stretching endlessly in every direction. And a group of tired Viking sailors resting beneath the open sky, sleeping just a few feet above the cold northern ocean as their journey continued onward through the night. And on nights when the sea was especially calm, the longship moved so smoothly that the crew barely felt the motion at all. The hull would glide across the water like a long shadow. The bow parting the waves with only the softest sound. Those were the nights sailors often remembered most fondly. Because calm seas brought a rare kind of peace. The wind softened. The sail hung steady above them. And the stars reflected faintly in the dark water, making the ocean seem almost endless in its quiet depth. For the men resting along the benches, these peaceful moments offered the closest thing to comfort that the longship could provide. The wooden planks beneath them might still be hard. The air might still carry the chill of northern waters. But without strong wind or heavy waves, sleep came more easily. A Viking might pull his cloak tighter around his shoulders, tuck one arm beneath his head, and close his eyes while the ship drifted forward under the guidance of the sail. Sometimes the watchman would hear small sounds from the darkness. A distant splash from a fish breaking the surface. The soft wings of a seabird gliding low across the water. Or the faint creak of the mast as the wind shifted slightly in the night air. Each sound carried clearly across the open sea. And because there were so few other noises, even the smallest movement seemed noticeable. But none of it disturbed the crew for long. After days or weeks on the ship, their bodies had grown used to these quiet sounds. They blended together into the background of life at sea. The longship itself seemed almost alive in those moments. Wood expanding and settling. Rope stretching gently under tension. The sail breathing softly as the wind filled it and relaxed again. All of these movements formed a rhythm that continued hour after hour. And beneath that rhythm, the crew slept. Some slept deeply, completely exhausted from rowing and balancing on the moving deck. Others slept more lightly, their bodies still aware of the ship's motion and the surrounding sea. Either way, rest came in whatever form it could. Because rest was what allowed the voyage to continue. The next morning would bring the same work as always. Oars lifted. Sail adjusted. Food shared among the crew. Water rationed carefully. And the ship moving forward once again. For Viking sailors, every mile traveled required energy. Every task required strength. Without sleep, even the strongest warrior would soon grow weak. So those quiet hours of rest beneath the open sky were not just a luxury. They were essential. And in a strange way, the simplicity of the Longship helped make those hours possible. There were no cramped cabins trapping damp air. No narrow hallways filled with shadows. Everything remained open to the wind and sunlight. During the day, the deck dried quickly after waves splashed across it. At night, fresh air moved constantly across the ship. This kept the environment surprisingly healthy compared to many later ships where sailors were packed into enclosed spaces below deck. Vikings may not have understood the science behind it, but they understood the results. Open air kept people stronger. Fresh wind kept sickness away. And a ship that stayed clean and dry allowed the crew to keep working. So the Longship continued forward, night after night. Carrying tired sailors across dark waters beneath the wide northern sky. Each evening the same quiet ritual returned. Cloaks spread along the benches. Furs arranged carefully against the cold. Watchmen taking their places beside the steering oar. And the rest of the crew drifting slowly into sleep as the ship rocked gently beneath them. Above them, the stars moved patiently across the heavens. Below them, the sea rolled endlessly onward. And between those two vast spaces, a narrow wooden vessel carried its sleeping crew across the cold waters of the Viking world, one quiet night at a time. And as the Longship pushed farther across the sea, the crew began to understand something that every sailor eventually learns. The ocean has moods. Some days it feels almost friendly. The wind steady, the waves gentle. The ship gliding forward with very little effort. On those days the crew might even feel relaxed. Conversations lasted longer. Jokes were shared more easily. The work still needed to be done, but the sea seemed willing to cooperate. Other days were very different. The water grew restless. The wind changed direction again and again. Waves rose higher, slapping the hull with impatient force. Those were the days when everyone stayed more alert. Rowing became harder. Balancing on the narrow deck required more attention. And when night came, sleep became slightly more complicated. A Viking lying down on the bench during rough water could feel the ship lift sharply beneath him, then settle again with a heavy splash. It was not dangerous most of the time. But it reminded the crew that they were never completely in control. The sea always had the final say. Still, Viking longships were remarkably capable vessels. Their long narrow shape allowed them to move quickly across the water. Their flexible wooden hulls helped absorb the force of waves instead of fighting against them. Even when the sea grew rough, the ship usually rode the waves rather than crashing directly into them. For sailors trying to sleep, that flexibility mattered. Instead of violent jolts, the motion of the ship often felt more like large rolling movements. Not exactly comfortable, but predictable enough that tired bodies eventually adjusted. Sometimes the crew even used the ship's movement to their advantage. A sailor lying down might position himself so that the ship's natural rocking gently shifted his weight from one side to the other. The motion was not unlike being rocked slowly in a cradle. And after a long day of hard work, that motion could become strangely soothing. Of course, not every sailor enjoyed the feeling right away. New crew members sometimes struggled during their first voyages. The constant movement could make sleep difficult. The smell of saltwater and damp wood might feel overwhelming at first. And balancing on a narrow deck while the ship moved beneath your feet required practice. But most people adapted surprisingly quickly. Within a few days, the body began to adjust. The legs learned how to shift automatically with the movement of the deck. The stomach grew used to the rhythm of the waves. And eventually, even sleeping on a wooden bench felt normal. Another important part of life on a longship was sharing responsibility. Every member of the crew had duties that helped the entire voyage succeed. Rowers needed to maintain steady rhythm. The steersman had to guide the ship carefully. Lookouts watched the horizon for land, storms, or other ships. And everyone helped with smaller tasks like repairing ropes, adjusting the sail, or managing supplies. Because of that shared responsibility, the crew developed a strong sense of cooperation. A man who slept too long might leave others working harder. A man who stayed alert during his watch helped everyone else rest safely. These small acts of trust built strong bonds between sailors. And those bonds mattered during long journeys. Because when night fell and the crew settled down to sleep again, each person relied on the others. They trusted the watchman to stay awake. They trusted the steersman to keep the ship steady. And they trusted the ship itself to carry them safely across the dark water. The sky above them often remained clear and enormous. Far from towns or villages, the stars appeared brighter than most people ever see today. Thousands of small lights scattered across the darkness. To sailors who spent many nights beneath that sky, the stars became familiar companions. Their positions slowly shifting as the hours passed. The North Star quietly marking direction. Constellations drifting westward as the earth turned beneath them. A Viking lying awake for a few moments might watch those stars move slowly across the sky before finally closing his eyes. And somewhere in that quiet moment, the ship continued forward. The wind filled the sail. The waves rolled beneath the hull. And the longship carried its sleeping crew deeper into the vast northern seas. Because in the end, that was the true power of Viking travel. Not dramatic battles or sudden discoveries. But steady endurance. Night after night. Bench after bench. Sleep after sleep. A small group of sailors trusting wood, wind, and each other enough to close their eyes while the ocean moved endlessly around them. And by morning, when the pale light of dawn returned once again to the horizon, the longship would still be there. Still moving. Still carrying its crew onward toward whatever new shores waited ahead. And when dawn finally arrived after another long night at sea, it rarely arrived suddenly. Instead, the darkness slowly softened. The black sky above the ship faded into deep blue. Then into pale gray. The stars disappeared one by one, retreating quietly as the first light of morning spread across the horizon. For the crew of the longship, this slow arrival of daylight was often the signal that another day of travel had begun. The watchman, who had spent hours standing near the steering oar, might stretch his stiff arms and glance along the deck. Most of the crew would still be lying along the benches, wrapped in their cloaks. But soon enough, someone would stir. A sailor shifting his position. Another sitting up slowly, rubbing sleep from his eyes. A third pulling his cloak tighter as the cool morning air brushed across the deck. Waking up on a longship was rarely dramatic. There were no bells to ring. No loud announcements. Just the quiet realization that the night had passed and work was waiting again. One by one, the crew returned to movement. Cloaks were folded. Furs were shaken free of moisture. Sleeping spaces on the benches were cleared so the rowers could take their places again. Because the benches that served as beds during the night were also the workstations of the day. Each man knew exactly where to sit. Each oar had its position. And once everyone was ready, the rhythm of rowing could begin again. Pull. Slide. Pull. Slide. The long oars dipping into the water in careful coordination, pushing the ship forward when the wind was not strong enough to fill the sail. It was hard work, but by now the crew was used to it. Muscles warmed quickly after the first few strokes. Breathing settled into steady patterns. And the ship began to move once more across the water. Sometimes the morning air carried the smell of distant land. A faint earthy scent that drifted across the sea long before the coastline appeared. Experienced sailors noticed these things. They might glance toward the horizon, searching for the dark line of land rising from the water. Other times the sea remained empty in every direction. Just waves, wind, and sky. And so the voyage continued. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher above the ship, warming the deck and drying any moisture left from the night. During those warmer hours, the crew sometimes rested briefly between rowing shifts. A sailor might lean back against the side of the ship, closing his eyes for a few moments. Not quite sleeping, but resting enough to gather energy for the next task. Because life on a longship demanded constant balance between effort and recovery. Too much work without rest would exhaust the crew. Too much rest would slow the journey. So the sailors moved carefully between both. And when evening eventually returned again, the entire cycle repeated. The sun drifted slowly toward the horizon. Shadows stretched across the deck. The wind cooled as daylight faded. The crew prepared once again for another night at sea. Food was shared. Water was rationed carefully. Loose equipment was secured so that nothing would shift unexpectedly during the night. Then, as darkness settled over the water, the familiar process of sleeping began again. Cloaks spread across the benches. Furs arranged to block the cold air. Bodies stretched along the narrow wooden planks that had already served as seats and workstations throughout the day. Above them, the sky filled once more with stars. Below them, the sea continued its endless movement. And the longship sailed on. Quietly carrying its tired crew across dark waters toward distant lands. A simple vessel. A simple routine. But one that proved strong enough to support some of the most remarkable journeys in the Viking Age. Because every mile of exploration, every distant shore discovered, depended on something very ordinary. Sailors who could sleep when they had the chance. Even if that sleep happened on a wooden bench, beneath the cold northern sky, with nothing but a wool cloak for warmth and the endless ocean rocking gently beneath them. And as the voyage stretched into many days, the rhythm of life aboard the longship became almost automatic. Morning. Work. Wind. Water. Rest. Night. Over and over again. At first, every new sailor noticed the discomfort. The hard benches. The cold air. The constant movement of the sea beneath the hull. But after enough days had passed, something interesting happened. The mind stopped fighting it. The body adapted. What once felt uncomfortable slowly became normal. A man who had once struggled to sleep on a wooden bench now found himself drifting off quickly the moment his cloak touched the planks. Muscles that had once protested every pull of the oar now worked smoothly without much thought. The crew began to move like parts of the same machine. Each man understanding the timing of the others. When the rowing rhythm changed, everyone adjusted. When the sail needed to be raised or lowered, several sailors moved into position almost without speaking. Long voyages demanded this kind of quiet coordination. Because a longship was not large. There was no room for confusion. Every movement had to fit neatly among the others. And over time, the crew learned something else that helped them survive the journey. Patience. The ocean does not move according to human schedules. Some days the wind pushed the ship forward quickly. Other days the sail hung loose and useless above the deck while the crew relied on rowing alone. There were days when fog covered the water so completely that the horizon disappeared entirely. On those days the world felt smaller. Just the ship, the crew, and a gray wall of mist in every direction. During moments like that, the crew often grew quieter. Voices lowered. Movements became careful. Even the splash of the oars sounded softer against the water. Because when the sea hides the world from you, you begin to feel very small inside it. Yet the Vikings were used to this feeling. They had grown up near these waters. They understood that the sea could be calm one moment and unpredictable the next. So they kept their routine steady. Meals were shared when food was available. Equipment was checked regularly. Clothing was dried whenever sunlight appeared. Even small repairs to the ship were handled immediately. A loose rope was tightened. A worn piece of wood was reinforced. A damaged shield was tied back into place along the side of the hull. Nothing was allowed to wait too long. Because on the open sea, small problems grow larger very quickly. And perhaps the most important skill a Viking crew developed during long voyages was simply paying attention. Watching the sky. Listening to the wind. Feeling how the ship moved beneath their feet. An experienced sailor could sense small changes before they became serious. The wind shifting slightly. The waves growing steeper. The air becoming colder in a way that hinted at approaching weather. When those signs appeared, the crew prepared early. Sails were adjusted. Loose objects secured. Extra attention given to the steering. Preparation was not dramatic. It was quiet and steady. Because panic helped no one on the sea. And so the longship continued its journey across wide northern waters. Day after day. Night after night. The crew rowing, steering, resting, watching the horizon. Each man depending on the others. Each man trusting the ship beneath him. And somewhere far ahead, beyond the line where sky and sea met, new land always waited. Sometimes it was a familiar coastline where trade or supplies could be found. Sometimes it was a place the crew had never seen before. A new shore. A new river. A new opportunity for exploration. But no matter where the journey led, every voyage began the same way. With a narrow wooden ship. A handful of determined sailors. And the quiet understanding that the ocean would decide everything else. The Vikings did not conquer the sea. No one ever truly does. But they learned how to travel through it. Carefully. Patiently. And with just enough skill to keep their small wooden ships moving forward across one of the largest and most unpredictable landscapes on Earth. And as long as the wind continued to blow and the oars continued to pull through the water, the longship would keep going. Carrying its crew onward into the wide, cold, endlessly moving world of the northern seas. As the days turned into weeks, the crew of the longship began to feel the strange effect that long voyages have on people. Time at sea moves differently. On land, days are measured by tasks, meetings, places to go. At sea, especially on a Viking longship, time is measured by wind, light, and the slow repetition of work. Morning comes with pale light on the horizon. Rowing begins. The sail is adjusted. Water is shared. Food is passed from hand to hand. Then the sun climbs higher, and the hours pass in steady motion. Pull of the oar. Lift of the oar. Pull again. Eventually the sun lowers. Evening arrives. And the crew prepares once again for the quiet routine of the night. After enough days of this rhythm, something curious happens to the mind. The outside world begins to feel very far away. Villages, farms, markets, roads, all of it fades into memory. Out here there are only a few things that matter. The ship. The sea. The wind. And the men beside you. Even conversations aboard the longship often become simpler over time. At the beginning of a voyage the crew might speak often. Stories about home. Arguments about past battles. Jokes that grow louder as the day continues. But after many days on the water, long stretches of silence become normal. Not uncomfortable silence. Just quiet. Each man focused on the work in front of him. Listening to the creak of wood. The splash of the oars. The wind pulling gently at the sail. Silence at sea has its own kind of calm. And in those quiet hours, sailors often spent time simply watching the world around them. The ocean itself is never completely empty. Seabirds sometimes appeared first, circling high above the water. Their presence could mean land was somewhere nearby. Whales occasionally surfaced in the distance, rising slowly before disappearing again beneath the waves. Schools of fish sometimes flashed like quicksilver beneath the surface. Even the color of the water could change. Deep blue in some regions. Greenish near coastal areas. Gray beneath cloudy skies. Experienced sailors noticed all of it. Because every small detail told a story about where they might be and what conditions were changing around them. Weather especially demanded attention. The sky above the northern seas could shift quickly. A calm blue morning might turn into heavy clouds by afternoon. The wind could strengthen without warning. Rain might arrive suddenly, drumming against shields and cloaks. When this happened, the crew worked together quickly. The sail might be lowered. Rowers prepared to guide the ship more carefully through the waves. Equipment secured once again. And everyone braced themselves for the rougher water ahead. Storms at sea were never taken lightly. Even a well-built longship depended on the skill and focus of its crew to stay safe. But one advantage Viking sailors had was experience. These waters were not new to them. Many of the men aboard had spent their lives near the coast. They had grown up watching the sea change with the seasons. They knew when the wind felt wrong. They knew when the waves were building into something more serious. And because of that knowledge, they were often ready before the worst weather arrived. Preparation was the difference between difficulty and disaster. Once the storm passed, the sea usually returned to its endless rolling rhythm. The wind softened. The clouds thinned. And sunlight once again spread across the deck of the ship. At moments like that, the crew often took time to check the vessel carefully. Ropes inspected. Wooden planks examined. Oars counted and repositioned. A longship was strong, but it needed constant care. Every sailor understood this. Because the ship was more than transportation. It was shelter. It was survival. Without the ship, there was only open ocean in every direction. And so they treated the vessel with quiet respect. They kept it clean. They repaired it when needed. They trusted it the way travelers trust a road beneath their feet. As evening returned once more, the longship continued its steady path across the water. The crew slowly settled down again along the wooden benches. Cloaks wrapped around shoulders. The air cooling as the sun slipped below the horizon. Above them, the stars appeared once again, scattered across the dark sky. Below them, the sea rolled endlessly onward. And somewhere ahead, still hidden beyond the horizon, another stretch of coastline waited patiently to be discovered. But for now, the longship sailed on through the night. Quiet. Steady. As the voyage stretched even farther, something subtle began to change among the crew. Not in the ship. Not in the sea. But in the way the men experienced the journey. Long periods at sea slowly reshape a person's sense of space. On land, distance is measured by roads, forests, hills, and villages. At sea, distance is simply the horizon, repeating endlessly in every direction. The same thin line between water and sky. Hour after hour. Day after day. For sailors on a Viking longship, this constant horizon became both comforting and strange. Comforting because it meant the ship was still moving forward, still surrounded by open water rather than hidden dangers. Strange because nothing seemed to change very quickly. You could stare ahead for an hour and see the exact same view. Blue water. Gray sky. White spray breaking along the bow. Yet slowly, almost invisibly, the ship traveled enormous distances. The Vikings understood this better than most people of their time. They had learned that patience was the most important skill a sailor could possess. You did not rush the ocean. You traveled with it. Sometimes the wind pushed the ship quickly across the water, the sail full and strong. On those days the crew needed to do very little rowing. The ship moved almost silently except for the soft creaking of wood and the steady rush of water sliding along the hull. Other days the wind vanished completely. The sail hung limp above the deck like a tired flag. And that was when the long oars returned to work. Rowing was never easy, but it was reliable. As long as the crew had strength, the ship could continue moving. Pull. Slide. Pull. Slide. The rhythm returned once again. Sometimes a single sailor would begin humming quietly during long rowing sessions. Not loudly. Just enough to keep time. Soon another voice might join. Then another. Simple songs developed from these moments. Repetitive lines that matched the rhythm of the oars. Nothing complicated. Nothing complicated. Just steady sound to match steady movement. These rowing songs helped the crew keep pace with one another. When dozens of oars entered the water at the same time, the ship moved more smoothly. Less energy was wasted. It was another small trick learned through experience. Everything about a Viking voyage depended on efficiency. Food was rationed carefully. Fresh water was protected like treasure. Clothing was dried whenever sunlight allowed. Even the shields hanging along the sides of the ship served multiple purposes. They protected the crew during battle, but during calm weather they also acted as barriers against waves splashing onto the deck. Nothing aboard the ship existed for only one reason. Space was too limited for that. And space itself was perhaps the greatest challenge of longship life. There were no separate rooms. No quiet corners. No place to truly be alone. Every movement happened within sight of the entire crew. When someone ate, everyone saw it. When someone rested, everyone noticed. When someone made a mistake, dropping equipment, misjudging balance, or slipping on the wet deck, the entire ship witnessed it immediately. At first this lack of privacy might have felt uncomfortable. But over time it simply became normal. The crew adapted. Personal space was replaced by shared routine. Instead of privacy, there was familiarity. Each sailor learned the habits of the others. Who woke first? Who preferred the morning rowing shift? Who stayed awake longest during night watch? These small patterns created a quiet sense of order aboard the ship. And that order helped the crew survive the long journey together. Because on a Viking longship, the greatest strength was not the sail, the oars, or even the sturdy wooden hull. It was cooperation. Dozens of individuals moving, working, and resting in careful coordination inside a very small floating world. A world surrounded on every side by the cold, powerful waters of the northern seas. And as night returned yet again, the crew slowly prepared for another round of sleep beneath the open sky. The sail lowered slightly. The rowing benches cleared once more. Cloaks spread across the wood. The watchman took his position near the steering oar. Above them, the stars emerged quietly from the deepening darkness. And once again, the Viking longship continued its patient journey forward. Across dark water. Through cold wind. Toward distant shores that waited silently beyond the edge of the world. And as the longship continued cutting steadily through the northern waters, the crew gradually became more aware of something that every experienced sailor eventually learns. The sea is never truly quiet. Even during calm weather, when the wind is gentle and the waves are small, the ocean still speaks in subtle ways. The wooden hull creaks softly as it moves across the swells. Water slides along the sides of the ship with a constant whispering sound. The sail shifts slightly above the deck, tightening and loosening as the wind changes direction. To someone unfamiliar with the sea, these sounds might seem strange or even worrying. But to the Vikings aboard the longship, they were reassuring. Each sound meant the ship was behaving normally. The wood flexing slightly meant the hull was absorbing the motion of the waves just as it was designed to do. The splash of water against the bow meant the ship was still moving forward. The quiet rustle of the sail meant the wind was still working in their favor. Over time, the crew learned to listen carefully to these sounds. A sudden silence where there should have been movement could mean the wind had died. An unfamiliar creak in the hull might suggest that a plank needed attention. Even small changes in the sound of the water could hint that the sea conditions were shifting. In this way, the longship almost felt alive to the men aboard it. Not in a mystical sense, but in the practical way that experienced sailors begin to understand their vessel. They felt how it moved beneath their feet. They listened to how it responded to wind and waves. And through that constant awareness, they knew when something required attention. This awareness was especially important during the night. When darkness covered the sea, vision became less useful. The horizon disappeared. The water blended into the sky. But the ship could still be felt and heard. The watchman standing near the steering oar relied heavily on these subtle signals. He listened to the wind moving through the rigging. He felt the pressure of the steering oar against his hands. He watched the shape of the waves as they passed through the faint starlight. It was quiet work, but important. While the rest of the crew slept along the benches, wrapped in their cloaks, the watchman remained alert. Not tense. Just attentive. His task was simple: keep the ship moving safely until the next watch took over. Sometimes another sailor might wake briefly during the night. Perhaps shifting position as the ship rolled gently beneath him. He might glance toward the dark outline of the sail above. Listen for a moment to the steady rhythm of the water. And then drift back into sleep. Because exhaustion always returned eventually. Days of rowing, adjusting sails, and enduring the constant movement of the sea required real energy. Sleep, even when it happened on a narrow wooden bench, became deeply valuable. The body took rest wherever it could find it. And that was one of the quiet strengths of Viking sailors. They did not demand perfect comfort. They adapted to the conditions around them. A wooden bench became a bed. A cloak became a blanket. The open sky became a roof. It was not luxurious, but it worked. And working was all that mattered during long voyages. Eventually, another faint line of light would begin to appear once more along the horizon. The first hint of morning. The watchman, who had spent hours guiding the ship through darkness, would notice it first. Slowly the stars faded again. The sky brightened. And the shapes of the crew sleeping along the benches became visible in the pale dawn light. Another day had arrived. Another stretch of ocean waited ahead. And the Longship, with its tired but determined crew, continued moving forward across the endless northern sea, guided by wind, patience, and the quiet routines that allowed these small wooden vessels to travel farther than most people of their time could even imagine. And as another morning unfolded across the cold northern sea, the Longship continued its steady passage through the water, carrying its crew deeper into the vast network of routes that Viking sailors had learned to navigate over generations. To people on land, the ocean might seem like an empty wilderness. But to experienced Viking crews, it was more like a series of invisible roads. These routes were not marked with signs or maps the way modern travelers expect. Instead, they were remembered through experience, observation, and stories passed down between sailors. A captain might recognize the direction of prevailing winds. Another sailor might remember how the waves behaved in certain regions. Someone else might watch the flight patterns of seabirds. All of these clues helped guide the ship forward. For example, seabirds often appeared when land was relatively close. Certain species rarely ventured far from the coastline. So when a sailor spotted a familiar bird circling above the waves, it could be a quiet signal that land might be somewhere beyond the horizon. Floating seaweed could offer similar hints. Long strands drifting across the water sometimes suggested nearby coastal currents. Even the color of the sea could change slightly near shallow areas or underwater sandbanks. These small details mattered. Because Viking navigation relied less on instruments and more on careful attention to the natural world. During clear days, the sun helped maintain direction. The position of its movement across the sky gave sailors a rough sense of orientation. At night, the stars became even more valuable. The steady position of the North Star offered a reliable point of reference. By watching how the constellations shifted over time, experienced sailors could keep the ship moving along the desired path. Of course, clouds and storms sometimes hid these helpful guides. When that happened, patience became even more important. The crew might slow their progress. They might rely more on rowing to maintain direction. Or they might simply wait for clearer skies before continuing more confidently. Travel across the sea was rarely rushed. The Vikings understood that pushing too aggressively against the ocean's conditions often led to trouble. So they adjusted their pace according to what the sea allowed. Sometimes the voyage felt almost effortless. A strong wind filled the sail and carried the ship forward for hours without the crew needing to touch their oars. On those days, the longship moved quickly, cutting cleanly through the waves. The crew could focus on maintenance tasks. Ropes were inspected. Wooden joints examined. Clothing spread across the deck to dry in the sunlight. Occasionally, sailors even used these calmer moments to sharpen tools or repair damaged equipment. Because preparation during calm weather often made the difference when rough conditions returned. And rough conditions always returned eventually. The northern seas were rarely predictable for long. Dark clouds might gather along the horizon. The wind could grow colder. The surface of the water might change from gentle rolling waves into sharper, more restless swells. When those signs appeared, the mood aboard the longship shifted quietly. Conversations became shorter. Movements more deliberate. The sail might be adjusted to reduce strain on the mast. Loose equipment tied down securely. Everyone understood that the sea was preparing to test them again. But that was simply part of the life they had chosen. The Vikings were not reckless sailors. They respected the ocean deeply. Not through fear, but through constant awareness. Every voyage required attention. Every mile required effort. And every successful journey depended on the crew working together in steady cooperation. So the longship continued onward. Through calm mornings and windy afternoons. Across empty stretches of water where nothing but sky and sea filled the horizon. Hour after hour. Day after day. The wooden hull rising and falling gently with the rhythm of the waves. The sail catching the wind whenever it could. The oars dipping into the water when the wind grew quiet. And somewhere ahead, beyond the distant line where the ocean met the sky, another coastline slowly waited to reveal itself, just as it had for countless Viking ships that sailed these same waters centuries ago. And as the voyage carried on, the crew began to notice the small signs that often meant land was no longer impossibly far away. At first, the changes were subtle. The wind sometimes carried a different smell. Not just the sharp, clean scent of salt water, but something softer mixed within it. Earth. Plants. Damp soil. The faint breath of forest somewhere beyond the horizon. Experienced sailors noticed these things immediately. A man who had spent many seasons on the sea could tell the difference between the empty smell of open ocean and the living scent of nearby land. Soon after that, the birds usually appeared. At first just one or two, gliding above the waves. Then more, circling and diving occasionally toward the water. Seabirds rarely wandered far from places where they could rest or feed. So when the sky above the longship began to fill with them, the crew quietly understood what it meant. Land was getting closer. No one shouted about it immediately. Viking sailors were practical people. They had learned that the sea sometimes played tricks. Birds might appear long before land was actually visible. But still, the mood aboard the ship slowly shifted. Men glanced toward the horizon more often. The lookout spent longer periods scanning the distance. Rowers straightened slightly, pushing the oars with renewed energy. Because after days or even weeks surrounded by nothing but water, the idea of solid ground held enormous appeal. Eventually, someone near the bow might notice it first. A thin dark line at the very edge of the world. So faint that at first it could almost be mistaken for a cloud resting on the horizon. But as the ship continued forward, the shape slowly grew clearer. The line thickened. Small rises and dips appeared along its length. Cliffs. Hills. The rough outline of a coastline. And suddenly the open ocean no longer felt endless. The crew could see their destination beginning to take shape ahead of them. It was a moment every sailor appreciated. Even if they tried not to show it too dramatically. After long days of rowing, watching, and enduring the restless motion of the sea, the sight of land felt almost unreal. Some sailors might smile quietly. Others simply stared, letting their eyes confirm that the dark shape truly was solid ground. But the work aboard the ship did not stop. Approaching land brought new challenges. The open sea was wide and forgiving. Near the coast, things became more complicated. Hidden rocks could wait beneath the surface. Sandbanks might appear where the water suddenly grew shallow. Strong coastal currents could push the ship sideways if the crew was not careful. So the steersman guided the longship slowly now. Rowers adjusted their rhythm. The sail might be lowered partially to give the crew more control. Everyone watched the water carefully. The color of the sea often changed near the coast, turning lighter where the bottom rose closer to the surface. Waves sometimes broke differently against unseen obstacles. These were signs that experienced sailors read carefully. As the ship moved closer, the coastline gradually revealed more detail. Green slopes rising above the shore. Dark forest stretching inland. Perhaps a river mouth cutting through the land like a silver path. The sound of birds grew louder. The wind carried stronger sense of vegetation and soil. After so long surrounded by open water, the world suddenly felt full again. Life. Movement. The promise of fresh water, warm fires, and solid ground beneath tired feet. But even then, the crew remained focused. The voyage was not finished until the ship was safely anchored or pulled onto shore. So the longship continued forward carefully, gliding across the calmer coastal waters. The oars dipping in steady rhythm. The crew watching every change in the sea around them. And slowly, patiently, the narrow wooden vessel that had carried them across miles of cold northern ocean prepared to complete another successful journey. One more voyage guided by skill, cooperation, and the quiet endurance that defined the sailors of the Viking Age. And as the longship finally moved closer to the shoreline, the character of the sea began to change once again. Out in the open ocean, the waves had been wide and slow, rolling steadily beneath the hull. But near the coast, the water behaved differently. The waves shortened and broke more sharply as they met the rising seabed beneath them. The crew could feel the difference immediately. The ship no longer rose and fell in those long, patient swells. Instead, it moved in quicker, tighter motions. Small splashes reached the sides of the hull more often. For the steersman, this was the moment when careful control mattered most. He stood firmly near the great steering oar at the stern, watching the water ahead. Every small change in the color of the sea or the pattern of the waves could signal something hidden beneath the surface. Dark patches might mean deeper water. Pale green areas could indicate sandbanks waiting just below. Sharp breaks in the waves might reveal submerged rocks. The Vikings had learned long ago that reaching land safely required just as much skill as crossing the open sea. Sometimes more. Rowers worked in quieter, more careful rhythm now. Pull. Lift. Pull. Each stroke controlled and deliberate. The sail might remain partly lowered so the crew could rely mostly on the oars for precise movement. As the ship approached the coast, the details of the land grew clearer. Tall grasses moved along the shoreline. Rocky cliffs rose in certain places. Perhaps a small river poured fresh water into the sea, creating lighter streaks across the surface. To sailors who had spent weeks breathing salt air, that sight alone felt almost luxurious. Fresh water meant drinking without rationing. It meant washing salt from skin and clothing. It meant cooking meals that didn't taste entirely like dried fish and sea spray. The birds grew louder as well.